Welcome to Inspire's third course here in Dhaka. I'm sorry I can't be here in person, but thank you for the opportunity to participate from a distance. Over the next 45 minutes, I want to talk a little bit more about what social protection is and provide a definition that is increasingly being used around the world. Talk a little bit more about the growth of these programs in Asia and across the developing world, and focus mostly on the impacts that build the case for implementing comprehensive social protection systems and focus on the relevance for Bangladesh. And then I'll say a few words about the limitations of these programs. This next slide gives a definition of social protection. It's a system, a set of both formal and informal public and private interventions that aim to reduce social and economic risks and vulnerabilities and deprivations for all people. And they have two very important longer-term impacts to promote inclusive social development and equitable economic growth. This next slide shows how social protection is a social service like health and education, but it also serves the purpose of facilitating the poor's access to these social services, and itself includes components like social assistance and social insurance and interventions, the transformative interventions that promote social justice. This next slide illustrates the growth of social protection programs around the world. And if we focus on Asia and look at the next slide, we see that real spending in this sector has about tripled over the past few decades and has grown about twice as fast as social protection anywhere else in the world. This next slide maps the impacts of social protection across a range of sectors and identifies that it's generating impacts supporting the achievement of 14 of the Sustainable Development Goals. And I want to focus on some of these in the next half hour, and this next slide illustrates some of the major areas where it's generating impact in terms of poverty reduction, human capital, livelihoods, enabling households to manage social risks, and more macro dimensions like promoting macroeconomic resilience and building social cohesion, and enabling the government to more effectively put in place economic reforms, because social protection shares the benefits of these economic reforms and builds the social solidarity and the inclusiveness that enables these reforms to succeed. Let's start with the first and the most important. Social protection mainly aims to tackle poverty and vulnerability and social exclusion, and it's not surprising that it generates significant impacts. When social protection programs are appropriately designed and effectively implemented, they're the government's most effective programs for tackling poverty and vulnerability. And we can see here in this slide on the poverty headcounts across regions in Bangladesh that over the past 10 years, the rise and increasing importance of social protection programs have led to significant reductions in poverty in the country, with also support from other kinds of programs the government's putting in place, and not least of all, the rapid economic growth over this time period. Perhaps a little more surprisingly is how important social protection is in building human capital. This is the second most common impact we see from these programs around the world. And at the foundation of this impact is the importance of social protection in building nutrition and achieving nutritional outcomes. And this graph here illustrates the importance of social protection in reducing malnutrition. This graph here shows that malnutrition emerges in Latin America and Africa and Asia in the first 2 years of a child's life. On the left side of that graph, you can see at age 0 months, the weight for age scores, the indicators most commonly used to measure undernutrition, they're about equal at birth across these regions of the world. But we see a big decline in weight for age in these poor regions of the world, pretty much in the first 15 to 18 months of the child's life. And after that, these weight for age scores are roughly stable. When we look at programs that tackle malnutrition in Mexico, Nicaragua, Colombia, South Africa, we see significant reductions in stunting and in general, broad improvements in nutritional indicators in households that are receiving social protection programs. And this next slide illustrates how complex this challenge is. Undernutrition is not just a matter of insufficient access to food. It also involves maternal care practices, water, sanitation, education, health, a whole range of interventions that are critical for promoting nutritional outcomes, starting with children. Now, social protection is a complex intervention. It's not just providing basic resources, it's also linked to developmental awareness programs that improve maternal and child care practices. It can promote a household's access to water and sanitation. So it tackles the underlying causes of malnutrition at a household level, which in turn has impacts on the immediate causes like inadequate diet and disease, and hence can be very effective in reducing childhood malnutrition. But I want to go one step further and show you this picture of a little girl's brain in the first 7 years of her life. This picture here illustrates the different components of cognitive ability, the brain's functioning and its capabilities. And you can see on the left side of this graph, that light blue curve and that darker blue curve that represent ocular vision and auditory skills. Now, not the eyes, but the part of the brain that controls vision. And not the ears, but the part of the brain itself that processes these auditory stimuli. These key brain functions that determine how capable a child will be and how capable that child will be when she or he grows up into an adult is most sensitive to the care and resources the child gets in the first few years of her life. And this key skill here, I'm just gonna fix this to stop this from beeping repeatedly. Okay, 1 second. Okay, go back here again. This brain graph here includes a whole range of other skills, but they all follow a fairly similar pattern. The key functions of these brains, quantitative skills and peer social skills and language skills and symbolic logic. I'm not a medical doctor. I'm not pointing to the right part of my brain here. I just want to illustrate that these key elements of human capability are most sensitive to the care and resources a child gets in the first few years of her life. Now, this next slide turns that into something that's more familiar to economists. That red line is your brain growing, and that blue line is the rate of return to investments in cognitive development, investments in human development. The next slide makes this a little bit clearer, that prenatal programs generate an extraordinarily high rate of return, followed by programs that are reaching children in the first few years of their lives. By the time you get to post-school investments, the rates of return are significantly lower. And this is important for a number of reasons, in part because one of the best investments, both socially and economically, is in early childhood development. The care, the resources, the nutrition, the stimuli, the security that young children and pregnant women have that enable this cognitive development. I want to highlight that it's not that early window exclusively. There's a second window of opportunity in early adolescence, as this next slide indicates, where depending on gender for girls, perhaps as early as 10 or 11 or 12 years of age, and for boys, generally from 12 to 13 years of age, there's a second opportunity for rapid development, both physical and cognitive. And it's in this second window of opportunity that the total nutrient needs are higher than at any other time during the life cycle. And insufficient nutrition in this period will significantly increase vulnerability to disease and to incapacity later in life. Now, this is particularly important for Bangladesh because Bangladesh faces today a very important economic opportunity created by its demographic trends. This next slide illustrates the dependency ratios. How many people in a country are dependent on each worker? And I'm comparing this for Bangladesh, that's the orange line, to Japan and China and upper middle income countries in Asia and lower middle income countries in South Asia. It's a little bit easier if we erase most of these lines and just look at the downward trends. That green downward trend there that we start with on the far left side of the graph, that's Japan during its most rapid period of economic growth in the 50s, 1960s, 1970s. At this point, Japan was growing faster than any country has ever grown. And that growth coincided with a decrease in its dependency ratio. That is, there were more and more workers for every dependent, and hence it was easier for the country to invest in increasing productivity and grow living standards. That next line there, the red one, the dark burgundy red one, is China. And the same thing a couple of decades later, China's extraordinarily rapid growth coincided with falling dependency ratios. And that dark blue line, that's upper middle income countries in Asia, sometimes known as the East Asian tiger economies, Taiwan, South Korea, Thailand, Indonesia. These countries were growing more rapidly during this period of their falling dependency ratios. And that orange line, about a decade later, we can see Bangladesh. when Bangladesh's economy began to rapidly grow, that also was a time when Bangladesh's dependency ratio was falling. But let's turn to the other side of that graph, the upward trajectories in dependency ratios. That first one, Japan, we see that dependency ratios stagnated from the late 60s into the early 90s and then began to rise rapidly from the mid-1990s. This rising dependency ratio was associated with economic stagnation in Japan. And we see here for China and the other upper middle income countries in Asia, the slowdown in growth has given rise to concerns in China and other upper middle income countries about a middle income trap. Now, turning more to the right, we see Bangladesh. Bangladesh still has falling and soon to be fairly flat dependency ratios. No immediate risk here of rising dependency ratios that create challenges for economic growth. But in the next 15 years, and in about 30 years more concretely, we see Bangladesh's dependency ratio will start to rise fairly rapidly. And that's a challenge because if there are more and more dependents for every worker, it will simply become more difficult for living standards in the country to increase. The only way that Bangladesh can maintain rising living standards in the face of rising dependency ratios is if labor productivity is growing faster than dependency ratios are rising. And so Bangladesh needs an investment, a social and an economic investment that can both tackle poverty and lead to substantial increases in the long-term living standards. And that's why the earlier picture on brain growth is so important. The investments in cognitive capital that social protection can provide generate investment returns as high as 18 to 1. There simply is no greater economic investment in a country's future economic prosperity than social protection. And particularly given the challenges that rising dependency ratios will pose for Bangladesh over the next few decades, this is an opportunity to both tackle the social vulnerabilities and lay the foundations for future economic growth. Today, when a college kid can type at a keyboard and create a company like Facebook with a market capitalization of $100 billion, today more than ever, the wealth of nations depends on cognitive capital. Social protection is not just a set of social policy instruments for tackling poverty and vulnerability, it's the government's best investment in long-term prosperity. We see in this next slide with secondary school attendance rates that youth in households participating in social protection programs are significantly more likely to attend secondary school. This next slide shows that social protection programs in Brazil and Cambodia and Ecuador and Ethiopia are significantly associated with reductions in child labor. Resources that enable children to go to school also reduce families' dependence on the income from child labor. And so we see increases in school enrollment and reductions in child labor going hand in hand. We see improvements in livelihoods. This next slide here shows how social protection by building human capital strengthens labor productivity and propels pro-poor growth. In South Africa, we see for every equivalent of $100 the government spends on early childhood investment in social protection programs, it's generating between $160 and $230 in future wage gains for the children who grow into adults and have participated in these programs. And these programs go further and help households to manage social risks. So this next slide shows how workers in households receiving the child support grant in South Africa a year later are significantly less likely to be out of the labor force and more likely to be wanting to work, searching for work, and actually successful in finding work compared to workers in households that do not receive these grants. And evidence from Bangladesh, the Rural Employment Opportunities for Public Assets, shows that a social protection program linked to a public works program and to a savings incentive scheme significantly increases financial savings, helps households to build productive assets, and increases their per capita incomes. And this next slide shows that across a range of poverty measures, this program has been very successful in reducing poverty, both the head count, the depth of poverty, and the severity of poverty as well. What we see is that social protection promotes risk management, it encourages investment, it drives both household investment and national investment, and lays the foundation for economic prosperity. Social protection also improves macroeconomic resilience. 8 years ago, during the global financial crisis, Bangladesh and many countries in Asia began to intensify their investments in social protection. Social protection puts spending power in the hands of the poor, and poor people use this spending power mainly to buy food. But food is also the sector of the economy, agriculture, on which many of the poor depend for their livelihoods. So social protection programs generate multiplier benefits by both providing poor households with direct benefits and stabilizing and stimulating the agricultural sector on which the poor depend. This has macroeconomic implications, making economies more resilient in times of crisis, because the crisis response also helps to stimulate and stabilize the overall economy. We see social protection also builds social cohesion, which is a major concern for investors who worry about the returns to their investment and the risks of social unrest. And economic reform requires a certain social stability that social protection provides. We can see a good example of this if we go a few hours away to a little island economy off the coast of Africa, Mauritius. Half a century ago, this was as poor as any country in the developing world. It had a vulnerable monocrop economy that depended on sugar, had very high poverty rates, and was suffering economic and social shocks. The government over the past 60 years, past 6 decades, has been able to put the economy onto an export-led high growth path. It has been one of the fastest growing countries in the world over the past 6 decades. The International Monetary Fund wrote a report trying to explain this and identified social protection as one of the key success drivers. By sharing the benefits of economic growth, social protection was able to support the government in putting in place these difficult reforms without social and political backlash. And so they were able to restructure the economy in a way that generated significant pro-poor growth. So this slide here summarizes all these different dimensions in terms of directly reducing poverty, building human capital, supporting livelihoods, enabling households to manage risk, promoting economic resilience, building social cohesion, and putting in place the foundations for economic reforms. These demonstrate both the social and the economic benefits of social protection. But I want to go one step further and talk about one of the most important reasons social protection has been successful over the past couple decades in Asia and across the developing world. And it can be illustrated with this systematization matrix. This is like the input-output matrix that countries used in the 1960s to plan their economies. But back then, the columns of these matrices were inputs like steel and rubber and concrete, and the outputs were things like automobiles and refrigerators and steel and concrete that then fed back into the matrix as inputs. Today, the inputs of these matrices are government policies like social protection programs, including social grants, or labor market programs like a minimum wage, or environmental policies, or nutrition, or education. The outputs are things the government cares about, things we care about, like reducing poverty, or promoting food security, or strengthening rural livelihoods, and things finance ministers care about, like increasing pro-poor and inclusive economic growth. Now, if we use the model that was common in the late 1990s in poverty reduction strategies, we might think if we want to reduce poverty, what's the best instrument? And we might assign social grants to poverty reduction, or the minimum wage to improving the decency of work. But that gets complicated because it's very difficult to invest enough in any one instrument to achieve the very ambitious objectives we have today as represented by the Sustainable Development Goals. And to illustrate that, let's put this into calculator mode, and let's invest say $1 billion taka in social grants and see what kind of impact we have on poverty reduction. Well, if we invest $1 billion in social grants and it's perfectly targeted, we might reduce the poverty gap by if we invest $1 billion taka in social grants and it's perfectly targeted, we might reduce the poverty gap by $1 billion taka. That's about as good as we can do. But an economist will come into the room and say, you're investing now $1 billion taka, you're only getting that benefit in the future, you need to discount it, that's a negative rate of return. Doesn't look as good when we evaluate the program in isolation. Now let's clear that calculator and let's invest, say, $1 billion taka in a minimum wage and see what kind of impact we have for its assigned objective, improving decent work. Again, we might see a similar kind of result. $1 billion invested in a minimum wage improves the decency of work by only a billion taka. A billion taka invested in the minimum wage improves decent work by only a billion taka. Again, a negative rate of return. So let's see if we can do better. Let's coordinate these two investments in social grants and minimum wages and invest a billion taka in social grants and a billion taka in the minimum wage. Why should this work better together? Well, one reason social grants don't work as well as they should is because a lot of the poverty in Bangladesh and around the world is poverty for people who have labor power that they want to contribute, but either it's not valued enough or people cannot find employment. When we talk to people in poor households that have workers, they don't say to us what we want. What we really, really want is a cash transfer. What we really, really want is a social protection program. They say what we really, really want is a decent job, a job that's safe and secure and rewarding and pays well. That's what people have labor power want. So if we can increase the decency of work, we more than multiply the poverty reduction impact of social grants. Now, what can social grants do for minimum wages? Well, a couple things. Minimum wages sometimes lead to an increase in unemployment, and social grants can counter those negative impacts. But social grants can also help enforce compliance with the minimum wage. If a worker says to their employer, wait a minute, you're not paying me my minimum wage, they often fear being fired. Whereas if they have a fallback position, a social safety net that will support them, a social insurance program like an unemployment insurance program, they're better able to stand up for their economic rights. So let's look at the impact here. Whoa, what's happened there? Why do we see so many impacts across a range of outcomes that we care about? And what's happening with poverty reduction and decent work, where the impacts both have doubled compared to the same size investments we made in the previous examples? Well, two things are happening here. As I described, social grants and minimum wages integrated social protection and labor market interventions simply work better when they're integrated together. And second, when we evaluate across the whole portfolio of outcomes we care about, we see that social protection also generates food security impacts and rural livelihoods impacts, and very important impacts in terms of human capital development. It helps promote a more sustainable environment and contributes to pro-poor growth. So these are impacts that also existed before, but without the comprehensive evaluation framework the systematization matrix provides, we don't necessarily count these outcomes. And so we undervalue social protection, and we undervalue the integration of social protection across the range of policy interventions. Now let's try one more time and look at the investment across the whole range of social and economic policies the government cares about. This is the real challenge, and the outcome we see there is a substantial increase in the achievement of the social and economic outcomes government cares about. Integrating social and economic policies together significantly increases the likelihood of the achievement of these objectives and maximizes the returns across all these sectors. I want to say a few words before I close. I've painted a very optimistic picture, but this doesn't always work. You may recall the graph I put up a few minutes ago on the impact of social protection programs on nutrition. And on that graph, on the very far right, there was the Honduras. And there was no bar on that graph, not because it was missing, but because the Honduras program failed to achieve impact. Poor design, ineffective implementation, and in particular, non-integrating, as the Honduras failed to do. They failed to integrate their cash transfer program with their health and education system reforms, and the result was a failure to build human capital. And then third, social protection often fails to achieve impact when there are bigger structural problems. If there is not an adequate supply of high-quality education and health services, we will not see human capital impacts. If there's a poor regulatory environment, then financial inclusion mechanisms can backfire and lead to poor households being made more vulnerable to unscrupulous financial operators. There's not consumer protection. If there is, in general, not an enabling legislative framework that protects people's rights, then these integrated social protection and development programs will be less effective. I want to conclude with 3 key points. Social protection's main impacts are to effectively reduce poverty and vulnerability. That's what social protection does. But we see in country after country, appropriately designed and effectively implemented programs go further. They build human capital, they contribute to livelihoods development, they promote a range of household level impacts that can be transformative. And when integrated within a broader policy framework, they can be the government's most effective instruments in promoting inclusive social development and equitable economic growth. Thank you.